So in the previous class, we have seen about the positive and negative interactions of the plant species. Now let us see about the ecological adaptation in this topic. Here we are going to discuss about the ecological adaptation. What is ecological adaptation? The modifications in the structure of organisms to survive successfully in an environment are called adaptations of organisms. The adaptation, it helps the organisms to exist under the prevailing ecological habitat. Based on the habitat and the corresponding adaptations of plants, they are classified as hydrophytes, xerophytes, mesophytes, epiphytes and halophytes. Now let us discuss about the hydrophytes. The plants which are living in water or wet place are called as hydrophytes. According to their relationship to water and air, they are subdivided into following categories. They are free floating hydrophytes, rooted floating hydrophytes, submerged floating hydrophytes, rooted submerged hydrophytes, amphibious hydrophytes. Free floating hydrophytes. These plants float freely on the surface of the water and they will be having direct contact with water and air and they will not be having contact with the soil. So now let us see the examples like Ecornia, Pistia and Ulfia. Commonly these plants it will be having floating leaves which helps the plant to float and it is attached to the stolon or to the offset. Some plants the leaves are modified into lamina which is attached to the inflated petiole. It will be having the fibrous roots. The roots are covered with the root packets so that it can be protected from any injury. Now let us see about the rooted floating hydrophytes. The rooted floating hydrophytes, the roots are fixed in mud. The leaves and flowers are floating on the surface of the water. So these plants, it will be having contact with the soil, water and air. The examples for rooted floating hydrophytes are Nelumbo, Nymphia, Potamogeton and Marsilia. The next topic what we are going to see in hydrophytes is submerged floating hydrophytes. So in this the plants are completely submerged in water and they do not have contact in soil and air. Example Ceratophyllum and Utricularia. Submerged hydrophytes. So these plants it is completely submerged in water and rooted in soil. They do not have contact with air. Examples Hydrilla, Vallisneria and Isotes. So Hydrilla it is submerged in water and rooted in soil. The stem will have branch which bears wholes of submerged leaves and flower. The last classification in hydrophytes is amphibious hydrophytes. It is also known as the rooted emergent hydrophytes. Here the plants are adapted for both the aquatic and the terrestrial modes of life. So these plants it grows in the shallow water. Example Ramunculus, Typha and Sagittaria. Hygrophytes, the plants which can grow in moist, damp and shady places are called hygrophytes. Example Habenaria orchid, Moses, bryophytes, etc. The morphological adaptations of hydrophytes. So, first we are going to see how these hydrophytes are morphologically adapted by means of root, stem. So, in root, the roots are totally absent in plants like Olphia. The roots are well developed in ranunculus. It is poorly developed in Hydrilla. We can see the root caps which are replaced by root pockets in Ecornia. Physical adaptation of hydrophytes in stem. The stems are long, slender, spongy, and it is flexible in submerged forms. In free floating, the stem is thick, short, stoloniferous, and spongy. In rooted floating forms, it is a rhizome. So the vegetative propagation will be taking place through the stem by means of runners, stolon, stem and root cutting, tubers, and dormant epices and offsets. The next, the morphological adaptation in leaves. The leaves are thin, long, and ribbon shaped as in Vallisneria. The leaves will be long and linear in Potamogeton. It will be finely dissected in Ceratophyllum. The floating leaves, it will be large and flat as in Nymphea. In Ecornia and Trapha, the petioles become swollen and spongy. In emergent forms, the leaves show heterophyly. You can see the entire leaf on the top and the dissected leaf on the base. Let us see the anatomical adaptation of hydrophytes. So, the cuticle, it is either completely absent or it may be present as thin and it is poorly developed. The epidermis, it is a single layer and it is protective in function. We can see the cortex which is well developed with parenchyma. So these parenchyma cells makes the plant to float on the surface of the water. The vascular tissues in the hydrophytes are poorly developed. In emergent forms, the vascular elements are well developed. The mechanical strength are generally absent except in some emergent forms. The pith cells are sclerenchymatous. So the physiological adaptation of hydrophytes. The hydrophytes have the ability to withstand anaerobic conditions. They possess a special aerating organs which is said to be the parenchyma.